Hey everyone. So in this very first video, I wanted to get you guys familiar with Adobe Illustrator as a product, as well as the Adobe Illustrator interface. So we're just going to go over the very basics and take a quick tour of the program. Now, the first thing we want to do is launch the program. So I'm working on a Mac right now, and I'm going to come down here and just open a new Finder window, and that'll open up a new window for me that I can work in. If you're on Windows, you would open up the new Windows Explorer window. And I'm going to come over here on Mac and go to Applications. On Windows, you would access your Program Files folder, and we're going to find our copy of Adobe Illustrator. Now, we're using Adobe Illustrator CC 2018 in this course. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on that to launch Adobe Illustrator on my computer. Now, once Adobe Illustrator opens, you're going to notice that we're in kind of a unique environment here. This is what is referred to as the Start Workspace. You can see that located up here in the upper right. And you'll notice at the very top we have two categories. We have Work and we have Learn. Learn gives you access to some fun videos and tutorials you can watch. And the Work category is going to show you recent files that you've worked on. And it's also going to give you the ability to access your Creative Cloud files. Now, we're starting from square one here, so don't worry. What we're going to do is we're just going to click on the Create New button. And when the new document window pops up that you'll see right here, I'm just going to click on Print to get started, click on Letter, and then click Create. Don't worry, we're going to go over those settings in much more detail later on. I just wanted to show you what you're likely to see as you start working within Adobe Illustrator. Now, this is what's called an artboard, and again, we'll talk about that later. But you'll notice that when you open a document or create a new one, Illustrator is divided up into a couple of main areas. You're going to notice that way up here, we have the menu bar. It looks slightly different on Windows, but pretty much the same. Here we have the application bar, which gives us quick access to different features within the program. Way over here on the left-hand side, we have what's called the Tools panel. Now, at last count, I think we had somewhere around 70 different tools in Illustrator. But don't worry, we're not going to go over all of them, and honestly, you don't need all of them. You only need a handful of tools to really get started using Illustrator. Now, one of the things you're going to notice, the Tools panel is, of course, a panel like any other. And you'll notice that when you first open Illustrator, this is in one long, skinny panel. And honestly, I find that a little hard to work with personally. And so what I'm going to do is way up here in the upper left corner of the Tools panel, I'm going to click on that double arrow icon, and that's going to switch this panel to a two-column view, in my opinion, making it a little bit easier to see all of these elements down here at the bottom. Now, over here to the right, we have what's called the panel dock. And the panel dock contains, well, panels. You'll notice over here I have the Properties panel, the Layers panel, and the Libraries panel by default. And you're going to notice that when you work in Illustrator, the Properties panel gives you most of what you need to get started. But you'll find very quickly that there's times when you're going to have to delve into other panels. Now, within Adobe Illustrator, you have workspaces that control what panels you see. And if you want to see more panels, you can go ahead and click on the Workspace button up here, and we can choose Essentials Classic. And they call it Classic because prior to this version of Illustrator, this is pretty much what Illustrator looked like. Now, don't worry, we're going to talk about workspaces later, and we're going to talk about some other elements as well. Now, right here in the middle of your screen, we have what's called the document window. And that is, of course, where the main document in Illustrator is going to live that we're working on. And in our particular case here, we have an artboard in the middle of our screen, and that's where we can start drawing our content. Okay? So again, keep in mind that when you're working in Illustrator, we're really focused on the Tools panel over here. You'll also notice now we have what's called the Control panel across the top of our screen, and then you have the panel dock. Now, in a future video, I'm going to go over how you can customize the panels and the workspace to make it your own. But for now, just understand that this is the environment in which you're going to be working, and this is where you're going to be creating all of your content. Now I'm just going to continue working with this blank document open at this point in time. And we're going to kind of start over. And what I'd like you to do is come up here to your workspace switcher, and I want you to choose Essentials. And then for good measure, click on that again and choose Reset Essentials. And that's how we can kind of reset our workspace. Now what I'd like to do is show you how panels work and how we can customize our workspace, basically the environment that we're working in, to make it our own and to make it comfortable for us to work. Now the first thing I'm going to do, as I mentioned before, this single column panel I really don't care for. So I'm going to click on the double arrow, switch over to a 2-column view, and I want to talk about how panels work. Now you'll notice in this workspace I only have 4 panels displayed. And you may or may not be okay with that, maybe in the very beginning, but as you get more proficient, you're going to need more panels, I promise you. So one of the things to take away from this video is that every panel in Illustrator lives under the window menu. And if I click on that window menu, you're going to see a laundry list of options here from which to choose. So here's an example. I'm going to choose, why don't we go ahead and open up our layers panel. So you'll notice when I choose that, it was already displayed over here, so it just activated it. Okay, perfect. Not a big deal. We understand how that works. Now let's go to the window menu again. And one of the things that I use a lot is the Align panel. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that option, and it's going to open up this panel here called the Align panel. Now, some of the options you choose in Illustrator, when you choose it, it's going to display that panel, but you'll also notice that sometimes it's part of a panel group. You'll notice that the Transform panel and the Pathfinder panel are also located in a group with the Align panel. Now, if you only want the Align panel, you don't want these other ones, what you can do is click on the tab and drag out to detach that panel from the group. And you can actually do this to all of them. Click on Pathfinder, pull it out, and you've detached them. Now, the other thing you can do with these panels is you can stack them. If I grab the title bar up here and I drag to the bottom of another panel, you're going to notice that once I get this blue line and let go, it's going to merge the two together, and now these 2 panels move together as one. I can do the same thing with Transform, just kind of dock that down there, and now these are all connected to one another. All right, so that's one way that you can work with your panels. Now, another way you could do this is you can drag this out. I'll use the Pathfinder for this example. Panels also have 2 different views. They have expanded view, and then there's also icon view or collapsed view. And if I click on this icon, it's going to collapse it to an icon. Now, this is where you can really customize how things work. And if you click on this again, it'll expand it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the title bar, and if I drag over here, if I wanted to, I can see how this blue outline appears. If I drag it in here, it's going to put it in the group with those other items. What I can also do is as I'm dragging, I can pull this down, and when I see a vertical blue line, I can let go, and now this panel is docked to the left of those other panels. And what I do a lot is I'll collapse these to an icon view, and then you can even hover over the edge and drag to a small little icon view. So instead of seeing like a whole button, now we're only seeing a tiny little icon. I personally don't have every icon memorized, so I like to display it so that I can see the name of the panel as well. And if I grab these guys, I can dock these 2 up here as well. So now all of these are docked over here to the left of these other panels. Now, one of the really useful panels that I like to use, if you go up to the window menu, as I scroll down a little bit further under the type category, I have the glyphs panel. And the glyphs panel is quite cool because it shows me every single character within the font that I'm currently using. And what I like to do with this is I will drag the title bar, and if I drag it till I get a blue line over here, I'm going to dock it to the left of the Tools panel. Now, I know what you're thinking here. You're saying, Chad, that takes up way too much space. And you'd be right. But what I'll now do is click on the double arrow to collapse it to an icon, and I'll even take it one step further and drag it over so that I only see a tiny little icon. Now, let's say this is how you like your environment when you're working in Illustrator. We can come up here to the Workspace switcher, click on the button, and I can choose New Workspace. And I'm going to call this workspace Brain Buffet. And I'll click OK. And now you can see that this workspace has been saved. Now this is how this works. If I click on this drop down, I'm going to choose Essentials again. Nothing seems to change, and that's because Illustrator remembers all those changes. But if I click on it again and choose Reset Essentials, it's going to look exactly the way that it did when I got started. But if I want to go back to the workspace that I created and the environment that I like to work, I'll click on this workspace switcher again, and I'm going to choose Brain Buffet. And now my workspace has been reconfigured to the way that I saved it. One more topic I want to talk about before we dive in and start creating content in Illustrator is the concept of preferences. Now, just like you and I have certain preferences that we prefer, such as what kind of car we like to drive or what kind of sport we like to play, Illustrator also has preferences that are very similar. And preferences in Illustrator control things like how the program behaves, how certain things work. And I want to show you a few of them that can really be helpful as you start working in Illustrator. Now, on the Mac platform, you're going to come up here and click on the Illustrator menu. And if you're on Windows, you're going to come over here and click on the Edit menu. And within each one of those respective menus, we're going to go to Preferences, and we'll start off by choosing General. Now, there are many, many preferences inside of Illustrator, and I'm certainly not going to cover all of them here. I just want to cover a couple of key ones. And so one of the things I like to do is I'll come down here and go to the Type category. And when we're adjusting type using our keyboard, these increments are the default increments that are used as those adjustments are made. I don't really like those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the size and leading to 1 point, the tracking to 5/1000th of an M, and the baseline shift to 1. Then I'm going to come down here to the Units category. And one of the things you'll notice is that in the General category, the default here is going to be set to points. Now, I don't know about you, but when I talk about measurements in a program or measurements in general, I very, very rarely, if at all, refer to the length or the size of something in points. Now, when it comes to type or stroke weights, points definitely make sense. But under the General category, I'm going to change that value to inches. I'm going to move down a little bit, and we're going to click on the User Interface section. And one of the things we can do in Illustrator is we can adjust our user interface brightness to be either darker or on the lighter side of things. This all depends on how you like to work. Regardless of which brightness setting you choose, one of the things that I like to do is change the canvas color to white. And that way, as I work, I can see the items that I'm working on a little bit more easily. Finally, down here when it comes to performance, one of the things that you may encounter is that the version of Illustrator that we're using, which is Creative Cloud 2018, is able to take advantage of the GPU on your computer, which is the graphics processing unit. If it can take advantage of it, it'll be checked as you see here. And if it can't, it'll probably be grayed out. Finally, under File Handling and Clipboard, Illustrator CC 2018 includes an automatic save recovery for your file. And this is really, really helpful in the event that your computer crashes or a power outage or any other unforeseen circumstance. So what you're going to see here is the default value is to save that data every 2 minutes. Typically, that's pretty good. If I only lose 2 minutes of work, I'm totally a happy guy. But you can, of course, change that to be 1 minute or 30 seconds if you wish as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And now that I've made those preferences changes, that is going to apply to Illustrator as an application and is going to take effect moving forward as I create my content.
So let's talk about another couple tricks that are really gonna kind of help you out a little bit. So one of the first things I want you guys to know about is that sometimes you just want to look at your art, the whole thing. The easiest way to do that is if you double click on this hand tool, it fits the artboard automatically to the screen, exactly to the size of the screen. If I double click on the zoom tool, it zooms into 100%, and we can see the zoom level right down here in the bottom of the screen. So that's kind of like really great tips to know. Another super awesome tip to know is that the hand tool, you can kind of use it to just sort of grab your paper and move it around. But even if I'm in another tool like this text tool, if I hold spacebar, it temporarily turns to the hand tool. So I can just kind of move the document around. This just really comes in handy when you're kind of working on documents because it's a little bit easier to get to the part of the document that you need to work on. So those are a couple really cool tricks. Trying to think of anything else that's super helpful. When you're in the menus, you can see that on the right-hand side, you've got all of these little indicators over here that show you what these shortcuts are. So these are the keyboard shortcuts for some real common tools or options you might use. Control Z or Command Z on the Mac, that's undo, right? Like standard for most machines. Control X, C, and V for cut, copy, and paste. These are all real standard kind of things, but you'll see some of the other ones. Here's Control I is check the spelling. The difference between Mac and PC, by the way, is that on the PC, it's going to be Control and Alt. On the Mac, it's going to be Command instead of Control and Option instead of Alt. Those are kind of like basically pretty much sums up all of the differences. The other thing on the Mac is that if you ever need to go into preferences, you can see that it's here under the Edit menu on the PC side, but on the Mac side, it's under the Illustrator menu. I think that's pretty much it for just like other things that are sort of critical to know or just good kind of tips to get you up and rolling and getting into that pro zone of just being a really efficient user of the interface. So I'm going to double click here on the hand tool to automatically fit the whole thing to the screen. So a couple other things that I want to talk about, and I know we're kind of in like this intro mode, it's not super fun, but stick with me, okay? Because right now I'm about to cover something that is so huge and so important. It's something that you really have to understand, because a lot of people get frustrated with Illustrator. There's certain things about it that are a little bit counterintuitive, and a big part of that is that, as I said a little bit earlier, it's not really a drawing program as much as it is a building program. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this document we've had open, and I'm going to create a new one that's just going to be, I'll just go here to web. That's going to automatically set things to pixels, and the unit is pixels, and you see my color mode is RGB, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up just 800 by 800. Tell it okay. And what I want to do now is I'm going to draw a circle. And you can follow along with me if you'd like, right? The circle is under the rectangle tool if you're on that default tool still. And what I'm going to do is just kind of double click on the hand to get it to fit my screen. And I'm going to hold Shift. This is another really cool shortcut. When you hold Shift in all of the Adobe apps, it constrains shapes to perfect circles or squares or whatever, right? If I let go of Shift, see how I can make it skinny or squishy? But if I hold Shift when I'm drawing, it automatically makes it perfectly a circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just draw my circle here. And so a couple things that are a little bit different from Photoshop. The first thing is that we have a fill and a stroke. The stroke is like the outline of the shape, and the fill is obviously the fill of the shape. I can flip my fill and stroke by just using these little arrows here. And so now I have a white outline around a black circle. If I want my outline to be, instead of white, to just not have an outline, to not be there, I can click this red line through the object, and I can do it through the fill as well. That indicates that there is no fill, right? There's no color at all. Now I've got a black circle. Now what I'm going to do is really quick, I'm going to switch over to Photoshop. Here I have a document exactly the same. It's 800 pixels by 800 pixels. And what I'm going to do is go to my ellipse tool. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Draw a circle here. I'm holding Shift to constrain it. And let me just hide that. And here's what I want to show you. People sometimes tell me, well, I don't really need to learn Illustrator because I know Photoshop already. So they kind of do the same thing. It doesn't really matter much. Well, actually it does. Let me just show you what I mean by all of this though. I'm going to zoom in as close as I can to this corner. Okay, so look at this. I'm at 3,200%. And it looks hideous, right? It's real jagged here on the edge. With Illustrator, check this out. I'm going to do the same thing, zoom into this corner. And use my little trick by holding the space bar. I can move my document around. But look at this. There is a huge difference between this and Photoshop, right? Big difference in the quality. And guess what? We're twice as far zoomed in. We're 6,400% here in Illustrator. We were only 3,200 in Photoshop. The reason for that is that Illustrator is a vector program. And what that means is that all of the objects that we see on our screen, I'll double click my hand, all of the objects that I draw, they are created by these lines and curves. That's a mathematical equation, kind of like when you create a graph in your geometry classes. Because of that, every time you zoom in, the computer just redraws the line perfectly. With Photoshop, you're always stuck with this resolution problem. And this is why when you blow things up in Photoshop, they start to look terrible. They look really jagged and fall apart. But in Illustrator, the beauty of it is you can zoom in as close as you want or blow it up as much as you want, and it's always going to look perfect. This is the beauty of vectors. There's also some differences in the way that it draws the shapes. We're going to see that in just the next video. But keep in mind, the beauty of vectors is that, number one, they are what's called resolution independent. You can scale them up or down infinitely, and it's always going to look perfect. Generally also, the files, when you're creating like simple logos and stuff, are much, much smaller when you're working in a vector program, because instead of having to have a bunch of information about, thousands of these little pixels, all it needs is 4 points. If I click, actually, let's click on this circle. You see this little dot here? There's one there, there's one there. There's one at the top, the bottom, and both sides. All it really needs is these points and a little bit of math that says what this curve looks like, just like in geometry class. And then Illustrator says we'll fill it in black. So it's a lot less information than Photoshop, which has to say make this dot black and this dot black, but make this one kind of a gray, and this one sort of a lighter gray, and this one even a lighter gray and a lighter gray here, and then these are all white. It's got to define what every single little pixel is colored. So vectors are super accurate, very high quality, and resolution independent, and they just never fall apart, because when it resizes it, it just multiplies its little equations here to make perfect lines, and it redraws them every single time. Okay, so we've talked in some detail about vectors, and I just want to kind of wrap it up with a couple other very cool things about vectors, and another really cool thing about Illustrator that we're going to get into a little bit deeper later. The first thing, though, is that what we're looking at here when we are looking at our documents in Illustrator with the color and everything is what's called a preview. And underneath this preview is the actual, let me just kind of zoom it out, is the actual structure. And we can view those by going to here to view. And if we change outline, If we go to outline mode, look, you can see all of the lines that actually make up the document. If we go back to view and go to GPU preview or preview on CPU, these options may be a little bit different based on your computer. We can even just choose preview on CPU. This is a very small image. But this is where we can see all of these different options in terms of the color and the outline, which is called, as I mentioned earlier, the stroke. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here to the stroke, and I'm going to change its color to red. And I'm also going to bump up the stroke. And see how I'm getting that fat kind of outline? Now, this is, the way I think about it is like clothes, right? So this is what my circle looks like. That's the actual shape of my circle. But then we put this kind of costume on it so that it can, show this black center and this red stroke or outline. So when you're working in Illustrator, you actually are working with all of those underlying shapes and structures, and then Illustrator is what's actually putting all of these different colors and stuff, but it's just an appearance that it kind of throws on over at the end. So that's not super critical to understand now, but a little bit later, it will start making a lot more sense why that matters. The other thing that I wanted to show you about vectors is that these objects, if I click on this white arrow, which is called the direct selection tool, right? So we have the selection tool and the direct selection tool. Because the direct selection tool lets us click on these individual little points that make up our shapes, and I can reshape my object. See how I can drag that around? Photoshop, you can't really do this. You can kind of bend things and push it around a little bit, but it's not going to be this kind of quality because, again, I can zoom in to 6400%. Okay, so look, this is my humongous outline there, but look at this, still a perfect shape, even though I kind of bent it up a little bit. In Photoshop, you know that when you start kind of bending pixels around or shoving them around, it starts to get fuzzy and blurry and you start to lose a little bit of quality. In Illustrator, it's just never, ever going to happen. It's always going to look absolutely perfect. Now, it, of course, handles a whole different type of image. If Illustrator tried to recreate a photographic image, it would be probably larger than a Photoshop document. It would be much more complex. But when Illustrator is just doing what it does best, shapes and really creating things from scratch, you will never get smaller file sizes or have better quality than you will with these vector images. And another really important concept that just because it comes up a lot when people get started and they get sort of stuck in this mode is that if I have a selection tool and I double click on an object, do you see how this gray bar just kind of popped up here? This is what's called isolation mode. And this can be really confusing and can throw you off at the beginning because what this lets you do is edit just this object, but it sort of locks all of the other objects. To get out of this mode, when you see this gray bar, all you need to do is click on this arrow. Click on it till that bar goes away. And I'll show you a quick demonstration here. So I'm going to draw a circle here and a circle here. If I'm in isolation mode on my big splotch, look, I can't edit this shape. So it kind of keeps me kind of safe from messing up my other objects. That's what the purpose of this isolation mode is, because a lot of times you have objects that are overlapping. This keeps you from accidentally modifying other objects and allows you to isolate, which is where it gets its name, this one particular vector object. If I just go back though by clicking this white arrow, then it gets me out of vector mode and now I can select and modify this object. So, oh, and I just realized this kind of looks like a weird monster with a humongous mouth. This is like what it looks like just before you're devoured by the world's largest catfish. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so it's a little unusual that we don't get rolling just right out of the gate with a project. And this is kind of like more of an exploratory thing. So what I want to do is just talk basically about the interface and some of the tools. And as we're doing this, you're going to have a chance to kind of play around and get familiar with some of the tools and things. What I really want to see everyone do is create a really unique new kind of design of your own. So it could be a cartoon character, it could be a landscape, it could be whatever. But just using these real basic tools, I just want you guys to experiment with the interface. And I'll be honest with you, the real goal here is get comfortable with the interface, get comfortable with kind of moving things around on your document, creating new objects, and having a lot of fun. So it's really not high stakes, although what we're covering is really important to know if you are going to be moving in towards some sort of industry certification. So keep that in mind, but this is really basic fun stuff that we're working with here. So no real end goal except to be creative. So you'll see that in my document, I'm creating things and deleting them because I'm just showing you some different ideas and different tools and how they can be used. And then what I want to see is you guys take it a little bit farther and kind of come up with your own combination of all these cool little objects to create something new. All right, so speaking of new, let's go ahead and do that. We're going to click on new here, and we'll use our custom profile that we created in the last project of inkjet. So this sets up to regular, printer type paper and really good for setting up for an inkjet printer. So I'm going to tell it OK here. And there we go, brand new document. And you can see that I have my Brain Buffet workspace that I created in the first set of tutorials, which is one that you can use if you want to kind of have your interface look very similar to mine, or you can customize your own. And just remember a couple of the real common shortcuts that I'm going to use all the time that I may not reiterate. If you hold the space bar, you see how my tool temporarily changes to the hand? That way I can move my document around. So it's a little bit easier than using these scroll bars. It's a little more precise, maybe I should say. If you double click the hand, that automatically makes the whole document fit within your workspace window. And if I double click on the zoom tool, it zooms me in automatically to 100%. So those are some really basic tools, again, that you should know and be familiar with. And now what we're going to do is just sort of explore some of the basic tools here in the toolbar, talk about how they work, and we're going to start building some illustrations just to get familiar with the tools and really with this new way of drawing that is, as I said earlier, a whole lot more similar to building things or kind of, like Legos or like construction type kits than it is to drawing with traditional drawing or painting tools. So let's check it out in the next video as we explore some of these different tools. All right, so as I said, in this set of tutorials, we're just kind of rolling through the toolbar here. One of the tools I want to kind of start with is this right here, and this is called the pen tool. Now, the pen tool, we're going to get to a lot later, but if you choose to click it, one of the things I want to show you is it's going to just sort of like keep following you around. And then sometimes you're like, how the heck do I get done with this thing? The easiest way is you can just hit escape, right? And that's going to just kind of stop that kind of path that you were creating. And then you can click on that with the black arrow tool and hit delete. If you click on this tool and you go click and then you click and drag, you can see that it kind of bends the line, but it's also going to bend the next line. Now, because of the way that this draws, it's a little bit counterintuitive. We are going to get to it later. I have a really fun way to learn it. But the thing is that you just kind of get stuck on this tool. You can see I'm double clicking. That won't get you out. The trick is to just hit escape and that will get you out of it. Another thing that you can do is just hold control and click, and that will kind of get you out of that path as well. To delete something, what we're going to do is click on the black selection tool. And what this does is this selects the whole object, and then we can delete it. And I also had a single line here. And you see how it was there, but we don't see it unless we select it. And that's because right now there's no stroke, which is the outline, but there's a fill. Since it's a single line, you can't fill in a single line. You can only put a stroke on it. And stroke, again, is sort of like an outline. If I flip these, you'll see that now, if I click off, we can see that object. But keep that in mind that sometimes with the pen tool or with any path, depending on how your stroke and your fill are selected, you might not be able to see the object. So one thing that you can do is just Control A. That's going to select everything on your document and then just hit delete key. And that's a great way to just sort of like clean up as you're sort of experimenting here. So again, we're not really getting into the pen tool. That's all I'm going to say about it. I'm just going to show you if you get into it, how do you get out of it? And we're going to just ignore both of these first two tools sections here. And we're going to start here in the next video with the text. Okay, so before we get going any further, I just had a cool epiphany. That's like when an idea just pops in your mind. And check this out. What I realized is we can shrink these down just to the icons. This is going to be a great way for you to learn what all of these are. See how when I stretch them out, I get the names of what each of these are, right? So that way, as we're getting started right now, let's leave this open this way so that we can see what these little icons mean. We get the names here. We may even want to open up a few others. There's a couple that I am going to make sure that you do have available. One that I want you to have available is symbols, all right? And symbols, you can see will kind of just pop out there. And by the way, to use any of these, if you just click it, it opens it up. And you just click it again and it kind of collapses down. And you can even leave one open like this, and that can be the way that you save your custom interface. So it's a really kind of cool way, definitely to get familiar with all of these different panels over here in the panel bar. I'm just thinking of some of the others that I like to have available. I definitely like to have some of the text-based things available. Oh, it's off the screen for me, but I'm going to open character and I'm going to drag that into this section here. And you can see that we get character, paragraph, and my open type tools. And these are probably most of the objects that we'll need for now. And another thing that you can do is you can always just click this arrow and then it's going to kind of go back into sort of open panel mode. I'm going to change that to swatches so that it's visible. But if I just choose this double arrow, it's going to drop it down so that I can always see the icon with the names. This is going to be a great way to get familiar with what these common icons are over here in our workspace. And I opened up the character panel because we are going to begin working with text, because there's a really important thing to understand about text, and that there are two ways of putting text into Illustrator. And even as we go here to the type tool, if we click and hold, look at all of these different options that we get. And this is kind of a great way to just sort of get used to all of the different ways that you can put in type. And we're going to run through these really quick. The main thing that I want you to know is that there is type and then there is area type. There's two different ways of putting text out on the page. You can also do type on a path, which we'll look at a little bit later. And obviously for that, you need to have a path drawn. And so we'll look at that in just a little while. But the main thing is this type tool and area type. It looks like the same tool, but they actually work really differently. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And generally what I do is I just leave it on the type tool, because if I have the type tool and I just click, now I am in point type. So I'm just going to type in the title of my autobiography. And I'm going to put in Manipotamus versus Monkeys, Battle of the Primates. Now, what I want you to do is put in your own text, right? Because this is really fun and cool if you sort of customize it and make it your own thing. And to get out of this entering text mode, I could just click on a different tool, or I can hold Control and click elsewhere on my document, and you can see that that ends the editing mode that I was in, okay? So one of the things that I want to do is I've got this type here. I'm going to just duplicate it. A really great way to duplicate is to hold Alt, and you can see that it changes my cursor so that it will duplicate an object. So really easy way to duplicate an object. And when I do that, you can see that I have this little circle handle here on the right hand side. If I click that, you can see I get this note, double click to convert to area type. Well, that's what I want to do. I'm going to double click that. And now watch the difference. Okay, so I've got one that's point type and one that's area type. Here's the difference. Point type, when I stretch it, it stretches the words. Area type, when I stretch it, does not stretch the words, it just reshapes the box. So this is probably what you're familiar with, like in a word processor if you make a text box. And then this is kind of a little bit more what you might expect maybe with a graphics program. The other way that I can draw an area type is, let's go ahead and select all this type. I just clicked a bunch till I saw that it was all selected, and I did Control or Command A to select all, Control C to copy it. And now watch this. If I click on the text tool and I draw a box and I paste, you can see that it automatically puts it into area type mode. So I need to kind of stretch it out a little bit. And you also notice when it first started, you see how I get this little red plus sign? That red plus sign indicates there's more text than is showing right now, and it's overflowing the text box. So if I stretch it out, I can see, oh, look, yeah, there's a lot more text in there. All right, so that's a real basic intro to text. It's important to know that there are two ways you can enter type, and depending on how you click, if you just click, you get point type because you just pointed there. If you draw an area by drawing a box, then you'll get area type. So it kind of makes sense if you think about it that way, but really important to understand the difference between these two ways of entering text. One of the things that I want to do is I want to talk about some of the basic ways that we can format text. And like I said earlier, Illustrator is just amazing at text. It's got very strong tools for working with text. If you didn't bring these panels out a little bit earlier, like I showed you, then if you just click on this character panel, you're going to basically get the exact same thing here, right? So look at the options here, and if I open up character, you can see that they're basically the same things. Now, one of the other things is sometimes you'll be doing a tutorial, and this is true of a lot of the panels. Sometimes you'll be doing a tutorial and there's more options in the screenshot that you see than you see in your panel when you open it. And it's very easy to fix. It's this little guy right there. See how it opened up, and now I've got all these extra goodies, and if I click it again, I go back to kind of short mode. Okay, so there's multiple ways that I can work with this panel, and a lot of the panels have these options, right, where I can get in kind of basic mode, which is the tools that I'll normally use, but there are some advanced goodies sometimes. Okay, so, but again, if you look at that one and then look here, look at that, they're the exact same panel. So that's why they're not open by default, because when you have the text tool selected, then they're just available right here. So let's talk about some of these really awesome settings. So the first things that you should be familiar with already, here is where you choose the typeface, right, or the font. Here is where you can choose the style of the font. And depending on the font that you use, you may have a lot of options here or only a few. And it really basically just depends on the typeface. Some you don't have any options. Here we pick the size. If I bump this up, it kind of makes my text larger. If I bring it down, it makes it smaller. Here I have the leading. Now the leading is the space between individual lines. So if I make this larger, do you see how the text is stretching down, right? There's more space between this line and this line. And the way I remember it is leading is between lines. It's spacing between lines. And you can choose just auto here, and it's going to automatically set it for you. Next, we have kerning. And kerning is the space between characters. Remember that. Kerning is between characters. They both start with that kind of hard C sound. And here's the thing about kerning, though, is that kerning, you need to select where it's going to put in the spacing. So let's say that I think I need a little more space between the A and the N. Generally, you would only really do this if you were working on like a big title and you wanted to perfect it. You wouldn't do it with a paragraph, but just to show you really quick what it does, here if I remove some kerning, it puts the space between them even closer. See how close that A and the N are? And if I increase the kerning, it adds a lot of space between the characters. Now, kerning is something that, again, it's sort of an advanced design concept. I never mess with it really in paragraphs. I only mess with it when it comes to actually setting up a title or a logo. You want to make sure that it looks really good. Now, the next one we have, though, is tracking. And tracking is very similar. And tracking is the whole thing. So I'm going to click on my selection tool and watch what happens when I change the tracking. If I go -100, see how it does the whole section? And if I stretch it up, it does the whole section. Okay, so tracking is the space between all of the characters. Kerning is the space between specific characters. So tracking is the space between the total set of text, and kerning is the space between character pairs. Okay, so really important concepts to understand. Now, beyond that, there's a couple other things that you can see. First, we have the vertical scale, and this is going to make the text larger. And let me actually just jump it up really quick. See how they kind of stretch really tall, right? The characters themselves get stretched. They get distorted. And otherwise, we can also change the horizontal scale, which is how wide the letters are. And you can see that when we stretch this guy out here, it kind of made ours a little bit skinny. So I'm going to set mine to 100. And that's the way that this font was actually designed to look by the designer of this text. A couple other options we'll just go through really quick here. If I go here to the O, this option modifies the baseline shift. And what that means is kind of like doing, you know, when like H2O and the 2 is kind of high up there. That's what this is for. I'm going to set it back to 0. And then this one here is actually rotation. So I can actually rotate. Well, an O is going to be difficult to see. So let's choose the P instead. And what I can do is if I go here to my character panel and I rotate it 45 degrees, see how it's changing the direction of that P, right? I can go 90 degrees. So I can kind of distort it all around. If I put it upside down, then it looks like a D, right? Because a P upside down kind of looks like a D. So I'm going to set this back down to 0, just so you can see all the different options that you have available for text. So fun ways to work with it. At the bottom here, there are some other options that you can play with. This is to put the text in all caps. This is called small caps, where capital letters are bigger, but they're all capital shapes. Here is where you can automatically do a superscript or a subscript. That's where the character goes high above or down below. And you can see examples of kind of how those look right there, superscript and subscript. And then this is underline and strike through. Okay, so that's basically everything there is to know about the different settings you have for characters. In character settings, basically the way that I think about these is that this really affects the letters. In the next video, we're going to look at paragraph setting, and those sort of affect the whole paragraph, right? Or the whole group of letters that you type together in order to make a paragraph. And we'll talk about that really quick in the next video. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is set up the paragraph styles. And, you know, actually I'm going to use this time the panel here. That way I can bring it out and you can sort of see everything. But this is just much easier. It's a much shorter panel here. And really quick, you've just got sort of all of the basics. We've got it left, aligned left, centered, and aligned right. Remember that technically a paragraph to a computer is all of the characters between two presses of the enter key, right? Whenever you hit enter, that makes a new paragraph. So to a computer, if you just type one word and then hit enter, it thinks that's a paragraph. Or it could be a million lines of text and you hit enter and it's still just one paragraph. An awfully long one that your English teacher would be mad about, but a paragraph nonetheless. So, but these tools you can see are fairly simple. They're the ones that we're familiar with. This is called justified text. And that just means that, and let me kind of make this paragraph a little bit longer. And all I did was I just copied that whole paragraph and I duplicated it a whole bunch. Okay, so you can kind of see here. But left alignment, you can see how you get this ragged edge, right? This line's longer than this one. When you go to justified, then all of the edges are straight up and down. And then you can have it justified centered, justified to the right, and then last justify all lines. And you see how it does this weird stretching out of your last line. And really technically, I think that this is what people would call full justification because it includes even the last line. But that's honestly, full justification is just a term that's not used too much in industry. Generally, it's going to be justified with last line, left, center, or right, or you have this option here for justify all lines. Over here, as you kind of screw down, you can see that we've got the left indent, and this is just going to indent the left side of the text. And this, of course, affects the entire paragraph. Because this is a paragraph setting, it has to affect a paragraph at a time. So I'm going to set that to 0. Next, we've got the right indent, and that's going to just how far does it indent from this kind of right-hand side. And if I bump that up, you can see that it's kind of scrunching in from the end there. I'll set that back to 0 again. And then here you've got the first line indent. So as I bump that up, then that's basically like a paragraph setting, right? To indent the first character on a paragraph. Here you can see it's the space before a paragraph and a space after the paragraph. This is really helpful. You can select multiple paragraphs and then you can give it a little bit of extra space between paragraphs to help separate them. Just kind of a tool that some people use to space out their paragraph text a little bit. And then lastly, you can turn off. You can see that it's hyphenated some of our text here. If we uncheck this box, then it will turn off that hyphenation. We go back here to a regular paragraph, and I'm going to delete all of this extra text that we had. And I liked it centered, and I'm going to also remove this first line indent to get it back to normal. And that's pretty much all that there is to paragraph text. Really simple. Most of it is just really obvious. And the thing that I want you to keep in mind is that, all of these Adobe apps, they're so well designed. Look at how the icon represents what the text will look like. So from these little icons, you can often tell exactly what it's doing. You can see here it's moving in that left edge. Here it's moving in the right edge. Here it moves in the top line. Here's space above the paragraph or below the paragraph. So a lot of times it just makes a lot of sense, and you can easily start to discern what these little indicators mean in all of your different panels. So that's it for paragraph text. Kind of easy to play with and just some good things to know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just put my paragraph kind of back into this panel here. Get it the way it's normally set up, and I'll close that panel. And the next thing that I wanted to do is just talk really quick about colors and how they're selected here in Illustrator. It's a little bit different in Illustrator than it is in some other programs. And I'm on the zoom tool right now. If I just click, it kind of zooms me in. If I hold Alt, it zooms me out. So that's kind of another cool shortcut to know. Remember that space bar allows you to kind of grab the document and just move things around, right? Temporarily switches to the hand tool. But check this out. Here we've got the text. A couple different ways you can change the color. You can do it here with these little color pickers, and that's for the fill or the stroke. And here you can also just kind of double click and it brings up the color picker. So if I want to change my text to red, I can just bring it down here to red, put it up here in this corner, tell it okay, and now I've got red text. If I click this, then I get to choose the stroke. Stroke is kind of like the outline color. So if I go here, I'll choose this brown, and there we go. We've got kind of a reddish chocolatey color, and that's the outline of our letters. If I bump up the stroke, you can see that it kind of gets thicker. As I move it down, it gets kind of smaller. If I get it down to 0, it goes away. And you can see that it changes my color picker to this indicator here with the red stripe through it, which indicates that it's blank or empty. So really easy to sort of modify the text. You can pick your colors here or up here. The stroke obviously only is available if you have stroke. Here is where you would pick the width profiles on the stroke, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And here's the opacity of the text. That's like, is it sort of see-through or not? We'll get to this a little bit later with some objects. It's just easier to do with objects. Now, one last fun thing that I want to talk about really quick, and I'm only going to introduce it and then give you a chance to just sort of play for a bit, is we're going to use these envelope tools, okay? And so if I click here, you can see that it changes my text. It kind of distorts it. And your settings, I have played with this. Yours are probably more like this. Actually, it's probably a lot like that if you're on Arc. And there's a lot of different settings, right? Look at all of these different options that we have here in these warp options. Let me move this over, actually. Right, I've got all these different settings that I can choose. And as I kind of increase these options, they will kind of distort it. And the important thing to realize is that this, again, is kind of like silly putty, right? So it's almost like you're printing the object or this text on a piece of rubber, a sheet of rubber, and then you can kind of distort the rubber sheet according to all of these different settings. Now, if you're not seeing the previews, you just need to check this box here, right? And then that will show you as I make a change, See, now it doesn't show it, but if I click preview, it will show it. So if I tell this okay, there we go. I've got my envelope, it's called, right, when you create these warps. And notice that when I click on the object here in my options bar now, it says envelope warp. So I can choose to edit the envelope, or I click here and now I can edit the text. So I can still go in here and modify my text. Now I double clicked on it, and so I got into my isolation mode. Remember, if you ever see this gray box, to get out of it, you just keep clicking the arrow until it's gone. And now you're back kind of in normal editing mode. So the envelopes are kind of a fun thing to play with. I'll close that, get it out of my way. And you can change all of your settings up here, of course, in the options bar. As you select the object, you can see that you've got the different options. If you want to change the type of warp, you can choose from this list here. These are the same options that were available when we had the dialog box open. We can choose it to be horizontal or vertical. How much, right? The bend is how much is that distortion kind of working on our text. And then you can have it affect the horizontal more than the vertical. So there really isn't a science to these. It's kind of just a matter of, experimenting with them a little bit, play a little bit, and see if you can get a cool effect. Generally, these are sort of noobish, so you don't want to spend too much time. It's fun to play with the first day or whatever, but these are not pro design kind of concepts, generally speaking. They're sort of quick and easy, and therefore they tend to look a little bit cheap. I know it's fun the first day, but don't get hooked on them thinking that these are the coolest things ever. As you become a better designer, you'll see that there's so much more elegant ways, so much more refined ways to work with your text. But wanted to make sure that you're familiar with the warp tools. Warp tools can be a fun way to play around with objects on your document. Okay, so now that we've got this done, what we want to do is I want to just kind of talk a little bit about the way that Illustrator works. So you can see here that we've got this object which is within an envelope. So we've got text that's inside an envelope, and really all text is vectors. So we've got sort of like these multiple layers of things here, and I want to show you how we can begin to break them apart a little bit. And one of the most important things to understand is that everything must have an underlying vector shape in Illustrator. And we can see that by going here to View, Outline. And you can see that it shows up when I've got this solid black text. Okay, what that means is that it's all locked down in text mode. If I draw a square, for example, a rectangle, here you see how all we see is the outline. But if I go back, instead of being an outline, I go into preview mode again, you can see that I have a solid square, and you can also see the colors of my text. And here you can see that the text is bent, where when you go to view and outline mode, the text is not bent. So it's almost like this is sort of the body of what's actually there. And then when we go to view mode in our preview, we can see with all the clothing on. This clothing is kind of like one of those Halloween outfits that make you look like a sumo wrestler, right? It kind of changes your apparent shape. And we can also see here that we've got a fill, right? We've got colors and stuff added to it, where in our other mode, in our outline mode, we only see the absolute basic structures here. So these are important concepts to understand because they'll help understand why we need to do this next step. And what I want to do is I want to click on this Manipotamus versus monkeys thing, and I want to convert this into its actual shapes that make it up, right, into its vectors. And I do that by going to Object, Expand. Now, just in the long term, remember that Object Expand is sort of where you need to go if you can't modify something the way that you want. If you want to do the types of changes we're about to look at, this is where you need to go. So I'm going to go to Expand here, and there's an Object and Fill. I usually don't mess with this too much. I'm going to just tell it OK. And now we can see that it looks a little bit different. And watch what happens when we go to our View mode and we go to Outline mode. Do you see how the text now is just outlined with no fill? What this means is that these are now shapes. They're in the shapes of letters, letters that are all curved up, but it's different than this. This is text. Down here, this is shapes in the same way that this is a shape. It's just the outline of the structure, and then Illustrator decides, or we tell Illustrator, when we preview it, Illustrator shows us what it's going to look like with all of the clothes on. The other thing that you'll see when I go back to view and outline mode, you'll see that this text is now, this curve is locked, right? I can't undo this curve. It's kind of like in Photoshop when you apply a filter not to a smart object, it can't be undone. You've actually modified that text in that envelope to be a shape that exactly looks like this, or a set of shapes that exactly looks like this. So I'm going to go back here, and the last thing, and by the way, under view, whether you choose GPU or CPU preview, it really is just a matter of how your computer's set up. If your computer starts acting grumpy, you should do the CPU preview. And if you don't have a video card that supports some of the advanced rendering, that's the only option that you'll have. If you have GPU preview, you can do that too. Usually won't see a difference, but when you're in GPU preview mode, it gives a lot of the power of Illustrator over to the video card so that it can fix some things and modify some things. So now that we understand that structure, right? So we've got text and we've got a shape now. It was text in an envelope, but now we've converted it to a shape, and here we have a shape that we drew. What I want to do is talk really quick about how we can modify this, getting into the basics of vectors, right? Modifying the shape of things by using the direct selection tool, the white arrow. And we're going to talk about that in the next video. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to start playing around with modifying these vectors. Because remember, we converted this into vectors when we did that, object, expand. So what we want to do is click on this white arrow tool, and you'll see that we get all of these little points to appear around our text. You see those everywhere? Each of these is called an anchor point. And there's two types of anchor points, and watch what happens when I click on just one. See here, we see the two types of anchor points. We can have either a corner anchor point or a smooth anchor point. And the difference between the two is that a smooth anchor point has one handle that ensures a smooth corner, kind of like you see here. A corner anchor point has two handles. So like watch what happens if I click this one. It's a little hard to see that one. Let's find one that we can. Okay, so let me just zoom in really close. Okay, do you see these little arms right here? These are called handles. And what happens is if I move this one, you see how when I move it, it's moving the other one? That means that this is a smooth anchor point. If I move one of these handles, it's going to automatically move the other one. Now this one right here, note that when we're clicked here, here's a handle and here's a handle, but they are disconnected. I can move one and it doesn't adjust this one at all. That makes this a corner anchor point. So it's important to understand the difference between the two, and you can take one of these. You can easily convert one by just clicking on this little button. The other thing is if you hold Alt, you see that? I just broke this little kind of connected smooth anchor point and turned it into a corner anchor point. To convert it back, the easiest way is just click on it and convert it to smooth that way. So it's important to understand the difference between the two types of anchor points, and I don't want to get into a whole lot about how we create these ourselves, customized, but what I do want to do is, let's go ahead and zoom out just a little bit. I want to talk about how we can use these anchor points to change and distort what we have got on our screen. So I can click on any of these anchor points, and as I drag it, you can see that it's going to distort my letters. So we can do all kinds of kind of fun things here by playing around with these anchor points and these handles. And this is a fun way to start experimenting a little bit with vectors without getting too deep into it, because it can be a little bit counterintuitive for some people at the beginning. What I want to do in the next video, though, is we talk about these a little bit more. We want to talk about how we can take text and create really fun communicative images where the word is drawn in a way that represents what it is. And there's a name for them, but I can't remember what it is. I'll see if I can look it up really quick. But all that we're doing right now is we're going to just be distorting some text. And I don't really want to start with my manipotamus text here. What I'm going to do, as a matter of fact, is just select this whole guy, get rid of that and that. I'll get rid of everything, as a matter of fact. And I'm going to type in vampire. This is an example of a project that I did when I was a kid, and I used to do this kind of thing on paper all the time, and I just thought it was so much fun to play around with this. So I'm going to bump the size up here, really large, and let's see, vampires, you know, it probably should be red. But remember, I can't modify this text at this point, and I'm holding Shift, by the way, to make sure that I don't stretch it, right? See how I can just stretch or distort it? But if I hold Shift when I use the selection tool, then it keeps me from distorting it. And now what I need to do is right click and do create outlines. If I have just text, not in an envelope, right click, create outlines, and now I have converted it into vectors, as you can see here. All right, so in the next video, what I want to do is show you a really fun way to play with this, and I'll look up the name of these fun little word art things so you guys can know what to call these cool creations that you're working on. So what I want to start doing is playing around a little bit with my text here, and I'm going to zoom into my V just so we can all sort of see it really easy. And what I want to do is take this point here, and I'm going to convert it. And I want to drag it down, and I want to make it look like a fang, right? So it's going to be vampires have fangs, so I'm going to put fangs on my text here. So I'm going to click on my direct selection tool and choose this single point here, right? And I drag it down, but you see that I can't really do anything with it because there's no handles here to bend my paths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click right here and convert it to a smooth point. And that's kind of not exactly how I need it to go, but what I can do is drag this one up, right? So I get this curve sort of the way I want. And now if I drag down, I'm holding space bar to be able to move my document around. Now here's the trick. I hold Alt. You see how I get that plus sign? That's going to let me break this handle so that I can get that V, oh yeah, looking just like a fang. That is tough looking. I wish my name was Vladimir just so I could make cool fangs out of my letters. So now I'm going to just do the same thing over here, right? Now, if it takes you a little bit to get into the groove of all of this, it's okay. And I'm going to show you another trick right now to help, because we can see if we drag this down, we're going to have, you know, well, let me just do it. Right? We get this big kind of triangle. I don't want that. So there is a tool that we can use, and again, we're really quickly just touching on this, but you see this add anchor point tool? We could either choose that tool, or we can just click here on the pen itself, and if you move over an existing path, you can see that you get the little plus sign. It's just going to add a point, and let's just add one right here. I kind of added it directly under this, and that one we can pretty much just leave, I think. And now I'm going to drag this down. Oh yeah, looking like a tough fang. I'm going to convert that to a smooth anchor point. That's one way I can do it. Let me show you another way that I can convert this anchor point. I can click on my pen tool and hold Alt. You see how I get that little arrow? Now what I want to do is just click and drag. You see that? Holding Alt temporarily switches me to the anchor point tool. And what that will let me do is kind of convert that point. Now I can just hold Alt again and create my actual little fang. I want to get back to my white arrow so I can click this and see both of my handles. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit to check my text. Looking pretty good. I think I just need to move this point a little bit. And again, the white arrow is the best tool for just kind of tweaking all of this a little bit. I can see my handle. Now I've done a whole lot of Illustrator in my life, so this is a lot easier for me than it may be for you, especially since, you know, for a lot of you watching this video, you're really new to Illustrator. Don't worry if this is just a little bit confusing. Play around with this, and what I'd like you guys to do, to really raise the challenge, go ahead and get 5 words done as a calligram. Now, it doesn't have to be where you're bending the text. There may be other ideas that you get where you can just use the actual text tools. Like I'll give you a simple example, and this is going to make it so that you guys can't really use this one, right? Because it's not original if you're just copying me. But I'm going to take the word look, and I assume that you can figure out how to draw a circle by just using the ellipse tool. But just in case you can't, what I'm going to do is just click the text tool, and I'm going to put a period. All right, I'll drag this to here, and then I'm going to hold the Alt key. Remember, the Alt key makes duplicates. I'll just put that there, and there you go. I've got the word look, and check it out. It's looking kind of over this way for some reason. I don't know exactly why. So here's what I want you to do. Go ahead and create 5 calligrams. I've done 2. Go ahead and see if you can come up with 5. There's some really easy ones, and if you need some tips or tricks or ideas, you could always look up the word calligram online, and I'll bet you find some really cool resources. I'll even put a link on the page where this video is so that you can get a quick jump to some cool examples of calligrams. Okay, so I'm kind of assuming that you had some fun with the calligram thing, but let's talk about ways that we can keep things together, because look, I've got multiple objects here. Well, let's just say I click on this and I drag it. You see how it disconnects from my little eyeballs there? So what I want to do is I want to drag a box around it so I've got everything selected. And then what I want to do is group these objects together. So in order to do that, what I want to do is just go up here to Object and choose Group. And now these guys are going to just move together. See that? To break apart a group, what I can do is just go back up to Object and choose Ungroup. All right, which is not what I want to do right now, but just so you guys know how to do it. And as I expand it, you can see that my text is even expanding the size of all of the objects together. I can also right click, and you see how, because I have more than one object, more than just text here, I can't do that option of creating outlines of these objects. So if I do ungroup, now I've got create outlines. And that created outlines, as you can see, of all of them, right? Even my little weird square periods there. Okay, so now that they're all expanded, I can select them all again, right click and group them. And now it is an image rather than text. And this comes in handy, especially when I give my document to somebody else. If they didn't have this particular typeface, Illustrator would get mad when it got on their computer and it says, hey, look, they said to use this typeface, but you don't have that typeface. So what am I supposed to do here? When you create outlines, it makes it so the person doesn't need to have that typeface. So that's actually a really great practice whenever you're exporting. You want to convert your text to outlines, and then that way, if the person doesn't have the typeface or the font on their computer, they're still going to be able to open the document and it's going to look exactly like it should. So I'm going to go ahead and just move my calligrams up here a little bit. I'm going to shrink down Vampire. I'll put it up here, and I'm going to take my little look and I'm going to put it over there. So I've just got these calligrams, and I'm hoping you came up with 5, right? That's a pretty good number. And what I want to do now is, we've done calligrams, now we're going to do cartoons. And I just want to talk really quick, going through the basics of all of the basic tools that are here in the drawing section of the toolbar for us to play with. And then I'm going to go through a couple other important concepts down here that are just really fun. But really, this whole first project is all about you getting used to the interface and really having fun. This should be a low barrier to entry. You should be catching on to this stuff pretty quick. I know that it's a little bit counterintuitive whenever you're working with the vectors. Like, you know, if you start doing the direct selection tool and you got to play with those anchors. Aside from that, though, it should be relatively simple. And I'm going to focus on doing things that don't require those tools yet, and we're going to slowly move back into that. So that's it. As we get going next, we're going to just kind of start talking about some of the different tools that we can work with to create some different shapes, and hopefully at the end we'll end up with like a little cartoon guy. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so really quick, I'm just kind of popping back after I recorded everything because I realized we hadn't saved anything for a while, even at this point when we had some work done. Probably a smart thing to do. So let's just talk really quick about how to save our documents. What I want to do is go here to File, and I'm going to go to Save. And the very first time you save a file, Save and Save As do the exact same thing, so it doesn't really matter. Save As forces you to give it a name and location. The first time you save it, though, you have to give it a name and location. So I'm going to click that, and I've created in my Documents folder a folder called Illustrator where I'm going to save all of my work. If you want to see how to do this, check out video 225. That's where I talk about saving these, and I actually make this folder. You can see that I've already saved the final project here. So I've traveled back in time to give you this video, which, let's face it, that in itself is pretty cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this calligram because we created these super cool calligrams and I want to remember that word. So hit save and you're going to get this dialog box. Honestly, for where you're at right now, you're just going to use the same Illustrator version, obviously, that you've created this in to continue working. So you can just tell it okay. What you should know about really quick, though, is that you can save for an earlier version. So if you want it to be compatible, maybe at home you've got CS5 or CS6, you can click that, and now this document will be converted to a format that is going to work with CS6. Some of the new tools might not be available if you do that, so use it with caution. Okay, I usually just kind of leave it on the newest version, whichever version I'm working in. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it okay. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, your goal is to come up with 5 calligrams. Look and Vampire are off the table. They don't count. You're going to have to create your own. There are some examples online, but it's really fun to just sort of figure them out on your own. I also suggest sketching these on paper. It's a little bit easier to figure out what you need to do and what you need to draw if you just have even a really rough kind of crummy sketch. But doing that will help you kind of plan it out and think about it. So now you also have your work saved. One other thing you should know is that as you're working, you work for 10 or 15, 20 minutes, to save the document updated with all of your new information, you can just go to File, Save again, or you can see the keyboard shortcut here is Control S. That's Command S on the Mac. So if I make a whole other calligram and it's super cool, oh my gosh, look how creative that is, and I don't want to lose that, I can just do Control S, that's Command S on the Mac, and boom, it's saved. To tell if your document is not saved, look up here in the toolbar. Do you see there's a little asterisk next to the AI there and the file name? That means that it hasn't been saved. So if I save it, Command S, boom, that asterisk goes away, and I know that nothing has changed on this document since I last saved it.